It's okay. I mean, it's not the worst wrench. I don't think that there is a clear-cut worst wrench anymore, but the Southern Hospitality is like the melee weapon equivalent of mini golf. It's not bad. It's just that the other options that you have are usually way more interesting and fun. So let's just back up here and talk about the stats, because the Southern Hospitality now seems to be as big of an engineer-player debate topic as the pre-Gunmetal Jag used to be. The Southern Hospitality deals bleeding damage on hit in exchange for 2 downsides. The wrench doesn't deal random crits, and you take 20% more damage from fire at all times. Pretty simple. So what even is the point of this wrench? Well, it seems that the strategy intended for the Southern Hospitality are as simple as its stats are. You can do more damage to players when you hit them with it, right? And because you always deal bleeding damage, you have a bit of an upper hand when dealing with cloaking spies, right? Well,
kind of. On paper, all of this stuff sounds like a pretty decent deal for the defensive engineer, who spends a lot of time staying out of range of pyros and within range of pesky spies. But in practice, I think it can end up being a lot less effective than you think it would be.
First of all, let's talk about the only upside that this wrench has: bleed effect on hit. The bleeding does 8 damage per second over the course of 5 seconds for a total of 40 extra damage. Couple that with the 65 damage from the melee hit, and this wrench can potentially do a little over 100 damage with just one swing. It sounds pretty good, but the engineer, along with many classes in this game, aren't really intended for melee combat. The engineer only has 125 health, so as you can imagine, getting close enough to enemies to where your melee weapon is the best option is usually ill-advised. So typically the only class you'll see yourself smacking with a wrench is a spy, since they tend to get within swinging distance. Well, that's just what the spy is designed to do. But remember when that one training video said that getting within melee distance of a spy is both dangerous and kind of dumb? Yeah, so how worth it can it be to risk your life in order to possibly do a little extra damage to a spy? It's not. But what about the bleeding effect? Like, doesn't the blood make it easier to track down an invisible spy? Well, sure, if you're really quick about it. In fact, I think that one situation is the thing that this wrench is intended for. However, even that was sort of nerfed a long time ago when Gunmetal dropped and they made it so cloaked spies have a reduced timer on debuffs, which includes bleeding. So now cloaked spies will only blink for 2.5 seconds when you hit them with the Southern Hospitality, which cuts both that extra damage in half and makes it easier for them to escape. So taking into account that the one main reason to equip this thing was indirectly nerfed more than a year ago, it only comes into play when you are putting yourself in an unfavorable position, and the damage is frankly quite negligible since it's an overtime effect and can be remedied by so many different things. The only upside to the Southern Hospitality isn't looking very useful. Now let's look at the first of the 2 downsides, the 20% damage vulnerability to fire. Now, usually when you're playing defensive engineer, a pyro is going to be one of the more uncommon enemies you should be encountering if you play behind your sentry gun, because unless one gets Ubered into your nest, they will just be mowed down by your sentry gun before they can even get close to you. So this downside doesn't really mean a whole lot. You'll probably have a dispenser close by too, so even if you get set on fire, it probably won't be a huge problem since you'll have a healing source close by practically at all times. However, I personally don't use this wrench because I tend to get set on fire more often than a lot of other engineers. I'm fully aware that I am an active Engie, and I've always promoted active Engie playstyles because I think it's more fun and it can be more rewarding since it makes you unpredictable and harder to pin down. So as a result, I generally find myself away from my sentry gun and dispenser. I spread those buildings out in order to give heals to my team. I constantly position myself to where I can move my gun somewhere else, usually more aggressively than the enemy would expect. So as a result, I find myself more often getting caught on fire by rogue flares or a scorch shot being spammed through a choke point. If I were to be more of a turtling Engie, I suppose the extra fire damage wouldn't come into play nearly as much, but that's just not how I play engineer. And then the last thing to mention about the Southern Hospitality is the lack of random crits. In competitive games, this downside doesn't really matter because in competitive servers, no weapons can randomly crit, but in pubs, random crits are almost the entire reason why people even consider pulling out their melee weapons in the first place. So in the first Jag video that I made 100 years ago, I mentioned how important random crits are when considering damage stats, and the conclusion of that point was mainly that when you're playing engineer, your wrench is probably going to randomly deal a crit because of how damage ramping affects your chances. Well, that same argument can easily be applied to the Southern Hospitality here. Doing 105 damage over the course of 5 seconds every time just doesn't stack up to doing 195 damage at an upwards of 60% of the time. So really, the no random crits downside is the most detrimental downside that it has. If you're already taking a chance by getting close enough to a spy to get Matador stabbed, why not just throw all your chips in and see if you just one-shot him instead of trying to slowly bleed him out and
and give him more time to sap your stuff. So, what do we make of all this? Is the Southern Hospitality even useful? I don't believe that it's unable to be used. I never really implied that. In particular, a lot of Highlander engineers like to use the Southern Hospitality because there are no random crits on all weapons anyway, and your friendly pyro almost always extinguishes you if you somehow get set on fire. And also following up on a bleeding spy if you do manage to hit them is something that most coordinated teams will be able to pull off with voice communication. It's also useful for hyper defensive engineers who like to stay very close to their buildings, don't get set on fire very often, and encounter spies who just as brainlessly like to spam their sappers and cloak away. The Southern Hospitality does have a use. That use is very specific, but it's still my least used wrench by far because it not only doesn't benefit my personal playstyle, but it's just boring. It's not nearly as interesting as the other options we have for wrenches in this game. The Jag is perfect for playing aggressively and quickly because the stats basically trade longevity for the ability to build everything faster. That's an interesting concept that comes into play all the time. The Gunslinger, an insanely powerful tool that completely changes the engineer into something else with just the addition of 25 health and replacing leveled guns with mini sentries. It's hands down the most game-changing weapon for the engineer. And even the Eureka effect, which for a long time was almost like the joke wrench, is now extremely useful for establishing your nest in setup time and adds a whole new plane of existence for the engineer by allowing him to teleport at will between multiple locations as he sees fit. It's probably one of the most creative weapons in Team Fortress 2 and adds new levels to the engineer's skill set. And then we arrive at the Southern Hospitality, which allows you to do one very specific thing slightly better, tracking down an invisible spy, at the cost of taking slightly more damage from a very specific thing: fire. In comparison, it's just boring. I personally think that even if the bleed effect did twice as much damage, if the fire penalty was lessened a little bit, if the wrench actually did deal random crits, I probably still wouldn't use it because the situation in which it's actually usable just doesn't happen nearly as much as the situations that the other options benefit. So I think the Southern Hospitality could use a rework. I think that it needs to become more interesting and more applicable to more situations. I honestly don't have any ideas for what a cooler Southern Hospitality would look like. Maybe you guys can throw some ideas out there in the comments. I don't know. Just let me know what you guys can come up with on this one. I'm interested in hearing what you guys have to say. In the meantime though, I'll definitely be sticking to literally every other wrench until the Southern Hospitality becomes something that's actually worth noticing. So thanks so much for watching, and before you go, I wanted to throw out a mention to my sponsor. Yeah, I finally made it, you guys. I have a sponsor, yes. But don't worry, it's not for something like an energy drink or some stupid epic loot box and something you guys won't be interested in. It's actually something you'll probably use. It's a website called marketplace.tf. It's a site you can go to find practically any item in Team Fortress 2, strange weapons, hats, skins, taunts, unusuals, you name it. They probably got it, and you can buy these items with real money using PayPal, your bank card, or even bitcoins if you're still into that for some reason. One of the biggest benefits of marketplace.tf is that there's no 1 week trading cooldown on any of the items that you buy. You can trade them instantly. So if you want to get your best friend a hat for his birthday and it's in 2 days, well, don't go to the Steam Marketplace. You won't be able to trade that thing for a week. These items even cost less than the Steam Marketplace too, because there's no obnoxious markup that Gaben puts on it so he can put more gold-plated ice cream sundaes on his Cadillac or whatever he does. So yeah, if you haven't gone to marketplace.tf for your TF2 stuff, I highly recommend it. It's made by the same people who came up with scrap.tf, so it's gotta be good, right? And make sure you use the coupon code UNCLE at checkout too, so you can get a key every time you buy 10 keys. I think that's a pretty good deal. So the link to the website is in the description. Go look at the website. At the very least, the color scheme is top notch. You're gonna like it. Anyway, enough selling out. Thanks so much for watching, and I will talk to you nieces and nephews next time. Bye-bye.